Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and I'm so delighted you've joined me this evening for another fabulous story, and I hope you're going to love this as much as I do. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And don't forget to leave a comment, because not only do I love hearing from you, but it's so great for the algorithms. So let's continue with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, if you were to look at George Finningham's life when he was about 41 years old in the July of 2002, through a translucent glass pane, you would likely think he had so much, but in George Finningham's eyes, he had so very little. Nothing you could do or say would convince the man otherwise. George would have been the first person to tell you that wealth has its advantages, privileges, and quintessential opportunities. It'll open doors for you that you never imagined possible, give you the best seats at restaurants, theatres and sports stadiums, buy you items of great luxury that you can feast your eyes upon for a while, until, like everything else you might own, the very items that had beguiled your senses become as boring and as obsolete as watching paint dry. It's certainly why the wealthy had garages stuffed with sports cars, so that when the novelty of the first car wore off, they'd simply replace it with another, and another, and another. And the more flashy cars they acquired, the less exciting the whole adventure would invariably become. In the end, like so many things in life that cease to have much point, but for so many wealthy people, they end up drowned by the mountain of stuff they own, that weighs them down like the clutter people gather up in their lives, that has no earthly use whatsoever. I mean, no one needs dozens of cars, do they? Let's not kid, wealth and its distinctive advantages will brush away your angst like the cobwebs on the ceiling, that can be infuriatingly annoying, and attend to the outstanding bills that need to be paid, and provide a buttress and cushioning of security to feather your retirement years. But contrary to what many people might believe, George deduced that Solomon in Ecclesiasticals put it very well, and he was the richest man that had ever lived, and was testament to the fact when he described the accumulation of so much stuff as meaningless under the sun, a chasing after the wind. George perceived that money was a useful tool, improving the luxurious furnishings of one's daily life, and buying a man privileges of note, but money cannot bring what every man is truly seeking, the fullness of the soul, the wholeness of life, the richness of joy. Even his wife Jessica had admitted as much, and she was in a powerful position to make such discerning, salient observations, having stood on both sides of the fence and tasted poverty first-hand herself, as much as she had tasted wealth. She claimed she was no more happier than she'd been when she was poor, living out of a car on practically nothing. She was a lot more comfortable, most certainly, but happier, not really. Yet in the good old days when she had struggled and managed to attain something in her life, the satisfaction she had gained from her accomplishments was immeasurable, much more pleasurable for her than just pulling out a credit card to pay for anything she wanted at the drop of a hat. Jessica was very worried that the couple's newly acquired wealth might turn her into a smug, self-centered, conceited person, which for her was a horrifying thought that she did not want to entertain. She discerned that many lottery winners became broke overnight because they could not at the end of the day cope with all their wealth, so on a subconscious level they spent it until it was all gone, so that the load of all that responsibility would lighten considerably, which is why Solomon so pointedly noted in his observations under the sun that a labourer's sleep is sweet, but the rich man worries about much. "I'm just so worried I'm becoming self-entitled," Jessica told George one day. "Almost as if I'm insensitive to the struggles of other people around me. I don't want to ever forget what it was like living in that car, literally on nothing at all. I don't want to become like one of those arrogant, haughty, self-satisfied, smug people that I despised so much growing up, who believe that being rich makes them better than anyone else, when just because one person owns a fancier car than the next doesn't make them any better than the other person." "I'm sure, my darling," said George tenderly, "you'll never become like that. The very fact that you worry and concern yourself about such things already, in my opinion, displays your sensitivity in regards to the matter. If you were spoiled and self-entitled, you'd never entertain such considerations, for they wouldn't even trouble your mind in the slightest. In a few short years, it would seem George's savvy entrepreneurial genius and innovative ideas, that included some nifty inventions in the building construction industry, had lifted his family out of their financial struggles faster than you could say Jack Robinson. So there had been a radical transition from rags to riches that had been most fortunate, and their lives were fringed with the benefits that wealth brings. But Jessica was always generous with her money, and gave freely to her friends that were less fortunate than she was, helping them in any way that she possibly could. George's overnight success meant that in the beginning he falsely presumed that he and his wife Jessica had at long last arrived at destination happiness, when fortune favoured their lives so graciously, and he thought, like a matching purse with a pair of shoes, that happiness and joy would surely follow close behind. After all, wasn't it safe to presume that these were the natural accompaniments that go hand in hand with wealth? Sadly, George was to find that that was a false narrative, and was far from true. For indeed George had made big bucks, more money than he could ever have dreamed possible of attaining, but it hadn't changed a damn thing for him. Even with all his wealth, he found he couldn't get the one thing he wanted most, more than anything in the entire world, that no money could buy for him. It was maddening. The insatiable need of his remained a forbidden secret shame that he refused to share with anyone, unless the judgment card was unleashed on his life, and he could not abide that under any circumstances. That would make him feel far too conspicuous. George was still as miserable as hell, and it seemed that there was not a jot he could do to change the turbulent dynamics of his own personal inner turmoil, that he had kept stoically a secret from his wife and anyone who knew him for a long time. But if you had been observant, you wouldn't fail to notice the man's hazel-brown eyes had lost their twinkle, and were clouded by a cloying deep sadness that he couldn't blot out. Even the way that George walked these days, with a slouched stooped posture and shoulders hung low, much like a willow tree, with its drooping boughs hanging over the water, as if looking for a lost coin in its silvery depths. His wife Jessica was always correcting him for his bad posture. "For God's sake, George," she'd say, "stop walking like a bloody penguin, will you? Straighten your back up, or in 10 years' time you'll bear an uncanny resemblance to the hunchback of Notre Dame, and that would not be a good look. The way you're going, George, you'll be old before your time, and when you're 60, people will think you're going on 90. "But I feel old," George had told her, "worn out before my time, and I'm only 41. I feel so empty, so lost. We've achieved so much in our lives, Jessica, but look at us. More than I could have ever dreamed of acquiring. But my heart is so heavy with a lugubrious melancholia that I simply cannot shake off." It would seem George never revealed to his wife Jessica why this was the case, even though she had actively encouraged him to go for counselling. Some secrets were best kept close to the chest, for if Jessica knew the sobering truth, that was certainly not for the squeamish of mind, she would be mortified, and would likely think her husband was as mad as a March hare. But George could not help the way he felt, nor could he comprehend it either. Indeed, he hoped that he would soon find answers that were troubling him so much. If only he knew why he felt the way he did, he might be then able to address the root of the problem and pull it out like a weed in the yard. George walked the stooped way he did, with that droopy, wary, overwhelmed, frustrated posture that you see in very deflated people who are tired of life. Let's just say he was down on himself, and he was sagging at the seams with a disappointment that every single doctor's appointment invariably brought him, again and again and again, as if Groundhog Day was being replayed on rewind, only this time involving different characters, different scenarios and experiences. He definitely felt, but the same old script was being repeated over and over again. That was almost beginning to sound like a broken record, that George Finnegan's ears had heard far too many times. "I'm sorry, Mr. Finnegan, but I cannot possibly perform such a procedure on you. It is not ethical. It is against the Hippocratic Oath, and any doctor willing to do this for you is not to be trusted under any circumstances, for they will only be doing it for monetary gain, and not have your best interests at heart. Indeed, Mr. Finnegan, such doctors should be reported for unethical procedures and struck off from ever being allowed to practice medicine again. Do you understand what I'm saying?" "But please, Doc," he would beg, "you must appreciate this is incredibly stressful for me. It is tearing my life apart," he'd say gingerly, watching the doctor's face for any sign of weakness that he could possibly exploit with the persuasion of his deep pockets. But he was always left bitterly disappointed. "Mr. Finnegan, I'm surprised you came to me with this request. I simply cannot oblige it. I understand your angst, really I do, and I'm sorry for the distress that you are going through, but this is not something I am willing to undertake for you, even if I were to make you happy in the process. If you want my advice, you need psychological help. This is not an issue in your body. It is all in your head, Mr. Finnegan, and that's where the treatment must begin." While George would like to have argued his case, he knew that there was no point dealing with doctors like this, who were resolutely determined to stand by their principles. His head would drop a little lower, like a limp flower hanging over a vase, as if its petals had been fully spent. Yet deep down under all the layers of denial, guilt, shame, and self-revulsion, he knew these doctors were absolutely right. If he was a doctor wearing their shoes, he would have also refused doing such a procedure on a patient. But they didn't have the first clue, the daily traumas he went through over this issue that pained his heart gravely, and he had sought out counselling for many years in regards to the matter, but a fat lot of use that had been, he had thought begrudgingly. The only thing that would ever make a man fully happy, George had promptly decided, is if you're happy within yourself, regardless of your exterior circumstances, which he was not. George knew unequivocally that if his problem could be resolved, happiness would all be but a pipe dream that was literally beyond his grasp. He discerned sagaciously that ultimately we are responsible for creating our own happiness, and it doesn't come from a hefty bank balance or cruises to the Caribbean every single year, or enjoying showing off your fabulous glossy pictures on social media, so others might grow green with envy on his account, when with wide eyes dripping with longing, they observed him basking on a bench outside the Taj Mahal, like Princess Diana had done many years before, wearing a lugubrious expression on her face that was so miserable it could have turned milk sour. The glossy pictures of the fabulous places George had visited with his wife Jessica may have gone some way to making him feel moderately better about himself in the short term, but the reward was so fleeting and so futile, as shallow as a vase of water, left behind after the dead flowers are thrown out, of which the murky, muddy contents have evaporated, and the water has become slimy and smelly. "If others are envious of us," George had concluded, "then there must be something to envy. Maybe our lives are not so bad after all," George would reason to himself, but he knew that that was not true. For George had sought out the wizened advice of some of the most learned spiritual men on the planet, who he believed might help him with his incongruous dilemma, or at the very least make sense of it in some way. For what had plagued George for almost 40 long years of life made no sense to him at all, nor did it make sense to anyone whose advice he sought out. On his intrepid, earnest quest to search for definitive answers and solutions to the problems that had plagued him all these years, mulishly sticking to him like a tick on a dog's back, that you cannot remove very easily, George had travelled all the way to India, in the faint hope that the sagacious answers he was seeking for the thing that preoccupied his attention every waking moment would soon be forthcoming. He was seeking out the help of a wizened Indian guru and yogi called Sanchez de Marina. You only had to say the name out here in India, and people knew whom you were talking about, and would nod their heads in great respect, for it seemed only ever words of wondrous awe were directed towards Sanchez, who was esteemed greatly in this part of the world. "Ah, I see. You come to seek the advice of the great Sanchez," said the taxi driver, looking at George curiously through the visor mirror, with the intensity of someone observing a rare species of animal in a zoo enclosure, which made George feel suddenly strangely conspicuous. The taxi driver, who was wearing a white turban on his head, nodded his approval at this revelation. He studied George through cheery brown eyes that complemented his nut-brown skin most favourably. He gave George a warm, bright smile, flashing at him a mouthful of white teeth that were clearly all his very own. People in America paid big bucks for teeth like this, but many people in India had naturally great teeth, and teeth were so much better when they were your own, and a hell of a lot stronger too. It would seem the teeth you got from an American cosmetic dentist had to be handled with great care, as George's white teeth had not come cheap for him, and he couldn't enjoy some hardened snacks that he had appreciated in the past, like caramelized nuts, lest his teeth should suddenly crack. It was one cosmetic procedure he had always regretted. His old teeth had not been perfect, but they had been a hell of a lot stronger. "Many Westerners seek out Sanchi's advice," the taxi driver told him. "We are not the first, nor will you be the last. Many come to seek his counsel." "I believe so," said George. "It is why I've flown all the way from America." Maybe it would have been polite for George to ask this friendly, garrulous taxi driver where he came from and what his name was. But India was alive with eye candy wherever you looked. It was too overwhelming, too daunting to ask too many questions, when all your senses were being overly stimulated all at once, everywhere you looked. There was just so much to take in. It was like being asked to drink 100 flavours of milkshake at once, and then describe them individually. It was near impossible. The taxi driver continued, "People like you, they come from miles away to seek Sanchez's great counsel. When they leave India, if they're lucky enough to speak with the great Sanchez, they are never the same," said the driver. For a moment George meditated on the taxi driver's words, not entirely sure whether they were ominous or not. He sat there in the taxi very still, like a hippo basking in a watering hole in Africa. Although, not to put too fine a point on it, George was a slim man with an athletic-looking body, even though he was not remotely athletic by any manner of means. For if he continued to walk with his sagging stoop, that streamlined, healthy look would likely soon abandon him in the years to come. George watched the dangling miniature cow adorned with garlands of fake colourful flowers on the taxi driver's visor mirror, that even without a wind was swinging backwards and forwards like a pendulum, and its swaggering movements appeared to put him in a trance-like state, almost as if he was being hypnotized. The taxi smelt strongly of cigarette smoke, intermingled with aromatic spices, which George suspiciously concluded came from snacks eaten inside the taxi, as people out here thrived on eating street food, and who could blame them for that? On every street corner someone appeared to be hungrily tucking into a delicious-looking snack, and they looked incredibly tempting. His stomach was beginning to grumble and complain with a great deal of hunger, rather like an insubordinate child that was begging to be fed. But George had only eaten an hour before he'd left the aeroplane, but these enticing smells were killing him with temptation that was hard to conquer. George had never been blasted with so many delicious smells before. They seemed to puncture the air like one of the bakeries he knew in Atlanta that made the best cinnamon bread he'd ever tasted. The cinnamon would waft down the whole street, driving people to the bakery with a brisk eagerness. It would seem out here in India it rarely was a sensory overload, the likes of such George had never experienced before. He privately surmised the people living here in such a vibrant, happening place were used to such intoxicating stimuli. He wondered what these sane people would make of the streets of Atlanta. He concluded that they'd find them dreadfully dull and uninspiring by contrast, and they probably would be right. George wondered whether the friendly taxi driver would be offended if he opened the window a wee bit, to allow some fresh air inside, to remove the muggy oppressiveness of all that smoking, but politely decided against it. The taxi driver was so charming. It wouldn't be kind to be so obviously rude. He glanced out of the closed window to watch the changing scenery. He was thankful that the taxi driver's air conditioning unit was working efficiently, for even when he'd left the plane, climbing down those steps from the craft to catch one of those airport buses waiting for him below, he had been met by the peppery, feathered waves of hot air, as if his body had been placed under a massive hair-drying unit. The stifling, humid, uncongenial weather was as muggy and hot as a Turkish bath, and he'd never enjoyed blistering temperatures at the best of times, where your skin could practically sizzle like bacon on a skillet. He noted on this trip that wherever you looked, your mind was being bombarded by the splashy, unrestrained vibrancy of life as it played out on the streets of India. He remembered reading a book once, written by a highly acclaimed author, whose name he could not recall, but the man had eloquently claimed that if you were tired of a great city like London or New York, then you were indeed very tired of life. But the words were better applied to a transfixing place like India, as so much was going on here, all at once, like 100 different musical instruments being played harmoniously together, and despite their contrasting, possibly even conflicting sounds, they miraculously remained in tune. Out here, he concluded, on the streets of India, hundreds and hundreds of stories were being acted out in the fascinating scripts of people's daily lives. George doubted it very much that you could get bored of people watching in such a riveting environment like this, with so much going on all at once. Maybe you could get bored of New York and London, but to get tired of this street drama would be virtually impossible, unless you had a migraine headache. Then a place like this would be far too overstimulating, and in that case you would need to retreat into a dark room just to still your mind. He clandestinely marvelled at the large throngs of spirited, characterful people, as brightly coloured as a bouquet of flowers, all who seemed to be walking around with an enviable sense of purpose written on their faces, which George so wished with all his heart he could apply to his own life, but it was not so easy. The women out here wore beautiful, colourful saris, in every imaginable colour. George thought they looked magnificent. Indeed, the streets bustled far more busily than the major streets in cities like New York, London and Paris, which George had visited regularly. The market stores here were literally buzzing with activity. Ostensibly, the disordered, shambolic streets here in India seemed to exist in what George would describe as with a bizarre kind of organised chaos that appeared to work rather well, like a higgledy-piggledy English country garden, where everything grows together in a tangled, tumbling sequence, with roses interlocked with delphiniums, larkspurs, daisies, and everything else besides. And this confetti of colourful blooms is astonishingly beautiful against all the odds, and everything within the abject, disarranged mishmash appears to work with a frictionless fluidity. It would seem that anything that appeared to move was on the roads here, from public buses, ambassadors' cars, old Vesta motorbikes, bicycles, two-wheel manual pull carts, dogs, monkeys, squirrels, sheep, camels, elephants, and of course let's not forget the lovely ladies, the cows, who were unequivocally the queens of the road, as everyone graciously made way for them, like in the streets of London would for the Queen of England or the King, in their golden carriages. The cows out here are treated like royalty. The traffic was bedlam. George had never seen anything like it in his entire life, and it was quite terrifying for any foreigner visiting India for the very first time, who might think that they'd booked a rather dodgy ride on a roller coaster that had been poorly maintained, and had the very real possibility of regurgitating you out of your seat, so that you went flying into the middle of the road like a smashed insect against the windscreen window. George found himself swinging backwards and forwards in the back seat of the taxi. Despite the fact that his seatbelt held him firmly in place, that was no consolation, really. He was still jolted around precariously, much like the cow statue hanging from a string in the visor mirror. Many might have perceived his taxi driver was atrocious, but on the contrary he was a master at his craft, with driving skills that could get him out of some treacherous tight squeezes, for with a proficient tenacity he skillfully weaved his car through the zigzag of traffic with a seamless ease. He told George he'd been driving his battered, rather mangled-looking taxicab for over 30 long years, day in and day out, and he was still very much alive, which George thought was a big plus. It certainly increased his chances, he hoped, with fingers crossed, of reaching his destination relatively unscathed. It would be easy for any foreign tourist to believe when acquiring a ride on these streets that this was their very last road trip that they'd ever make. But for some reason, the streets of India was a daily survival of a plethora of near-death experiences, which was pretty much the status quo out here, that people accepted with a pinch of salt, as if coming close to being pulverized on the road was pretty commonplace and standard daily occurrences that should not be looked on too seriously, as people out here lived in the moment. And besides all that, people in this part of the world believed in reincarnation. If you screwed up once, you could come back again and again and again to correct your previous mistakes. So in the grand scheme of things, cock-ups were no big deal. If you fell down, you could get up in the next life, and hopefully learn to stumble a whole lot less. As George sat in the back of the taxi, he held his breath most of the way. He was afraid to breathe, as if he was tempting fate. The taxi driver appeared to be cursing under his breath about the chaos in the roads. "You silly, silly man! Silly man! Silly, silly man!" said the taxi driver, as George watched a man bounding through the traffic, with 4 cows staggering behind him. And on seeing the queens on the road, every car stopped at once to let the cows cross. George's ears were almost deafened by the loud blows of people's horns, as out here there were no traffic lights or signage. But still, it worked. George stared out of the window, admiring the bright colours of the street markets, the people scurrying around backwards and forwards in their colourful clothes, along with the delicious spicy smells that wafted on the street corners: cardamom, cinnamon, cloves, turmeric, chilies and garlic. The fragrant, sizzling food made his stomach grumble in hunger. His mouth hadn't stopped watering since he'd got into the taxi-cab. George watched the bread from the street vendors as they flew their flattened balls of dough onto the red-hot iron coals. They all puffed up like soccer balls and looked absolutely delicious. He'd need to try some of that incredible-looking bread, dipping it in garlic and clarified butter known as ghee. Life did not get better than this, he thought. Why could he not stop thinking about food since he arrived here? It was not like this back at home. Good job he didn't live in India. He'd blow up like a beach ball. But come to think of it, he didn't see any real overweight people running up and down the streets. George cleared his throat apologetically. "Sorry," he said obsequiously. "I was distracted for a moment. The streets here, they're so colourful. The people very interesting to watch. I think I could observe them all day and never get bored. There is so much to see out here in India that I never envisaged for a moment. I mean, I've heard India is a colourful place, of course I have. But all this street theatre, I never anticipated this. So much drama. I mean, when I look out of the passenger side window, 101 things are going on all at once. I've never seen anything quite like it before. I mean, look at that willowy man over there. He looks as if he barely weighs more than a feather. He's transporting all those piles and piles of folded-up Persian carpets in that manual pull cart. Then that man over there wearing the orange turban, with a cheeky grin and the golden tooth, helping the cows cross the road, and the very attractive woman with the red dot on her forehead and her long black shiny hair, wearing that glittering gold and red sari, selling those gloriously colourful silks at a reduced price. Look at the people. They're squirming around her in delight to get in on a good deal. They look so excited and thrilled, almost as if they've won the lottery. I don't think I've ever observed such an enthused bunch before. Anything like that, let's say, a day in my life. So I do apologise. I believe you were saying something about Sanchez. Something about people never being the same after seeking his wizened advice. What do you mean exactly by that? He asked. The driver paused for a long moment, considering George's words rather carefully. Sanchez.
He will make you look within yourself, very, very deep. Too many people will look outside themselves for answers. Sanchez will make you look inside yourself to find the truth. And when you find the truth, you are free. Free like an eagle, are you not? You can fly in the heavens with your wings outstretched. But when you look on the outside, you cannot believe you can fly. You can only see your limits, not your potential to be more. Sanchez help you to be more.
I can't decide whether that's a good thing or not, said George sceptically. I mean, digging inside ourselves for answers. Sometimes I think all this soul-searching is overrated. In America, people are tirelessly visiting therapists. I have been to one myself, actually several. It's never been much help to me. Not one of those so-called experts with all the degrees behind them has helped me a jot with my issues. That's why I came to India, he admitted. Ah, but you are talking about people in your country who've gone to college for degrees that they believe put them in a position to give good, sound advice. But what do they really know? Said the taxi driver, shaking his head. In truth, they know nothing. Their papers mean nothing. It's like going on a gardening course with someone who's never grown anything before a day in their lives, but written hundreds of books about the subject. What can they teach you, these people? Without practical application, trial and error. If you're looking for answers to the soul, you need to visit someone who accesses the soul, who travel inward, not outward. Can you not see what I'm saying? Does it not make sense to your reasoning?
I think I know what you're saying, said George reflectively. I suppose it makes sense. I mean, if I had open heart surgery, I'd like to go to a doctor who's worked on hundreds of patients before he chooses to break my chest open. It doesn't matter how many degrees he has behind him. Experience is key. My point exactly. You won't regret seeing Sanchez's advice. Seeking it, I mean. I'm sure he will help you, but not in the way you think.
So there we are. That's the end of part 1 of our story. Part 2 is tomorrow night, and I hope you're going to enjoy me then, because this is such a lovely story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.